Good afternoon and welcome back for part 2 of today's End of the Civil War book fair at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson, Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum, as well as the public programs producer for this lecture series. If you are just joining us here in the theater or on YouTube, our previous speaker for part 1 was E. Lawrence Abel, discussing his book, A Finger in Lincoln's Brain, What Modern Science Reveals About Lincoln, His Assassination, and Its Aftermath. If you missed this lecture, it will soon be available on YouTube for on-demand viewing. Our second speaker for today is Brian Matthew Jordan, and he'll be discussing his book, Marching Home, Union Veterans and Their Unending Civil War. Brian Matthew Jordan holds a PhD in history from Yale University and is a lecturer of Civil War era studies at Gettysburg College. A native of northeastern Ohio, he discovered a passion for history at an early age. He is a frequent speaker at Civil War roundtables nationwide, delivers popular tours for Gettysburg College's Civil War Institute and the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, and conducts seminars for various teaching American history grant recipients. His published work has appeared in multiple journals, including Civil War History and the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. His first book, published in 2011, is Unholy Sabbath, The Battle of South Mountain in History and Memory, September 14, 1862. Please join me in welcoming Brian Jordan to the National Archives.
Well, thank you so much, Doug, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for being out here today. I spend a lot of time in this building, but usually upstairs, poring over pension files and documents, so it's nice to be on this side of the building with you this afternoon. In a few weeks here in Washington, we are going to mark the 150th anniversary of the Grand Review, that mighty victory parade that extended down Pennsylvania Avenue on May the 23rd and 24th, 1865. A parade that made its way beyond a wooden reviewing stand erected in front of the White House, teeming with military officers, political officials, and the new president, Andrew Johnson. It was a moment of unprecedented martial splendor. More than 200,000 victorious Union soldiers from both theaters of the war, striding triumphantly down the nation's avenue. It's always been a moment that has dazzled us, and it's announced to us for so long the return of peace and the end of the Civil War. And yet we might reasonably ask if that procession was the end after all, and if it indeed was even a celebration. For men in the marching ranks, that parade looked rather different. Having marched over bone-strewn Virginia battlefields en route to Washington, the men approached the Grand Review not as a victory parade, but rather as a funereal march. The absence of slain comrades was palpable as they made their way down the road, as was the absence of their beloved commander-in-chief, Abraham Lincoln, martyred just 5 blocks away 5 weeks before. These men, as they processed down Pennsylvania Avenue, were suspended between the dead and the living, and they would continue to live their lives that way, suspended between a haunting past and an uncertain future. I want to unpack their experiences with you this afternoon, focusing principally on the Billy Yanks after the war, but also contrasting them a bit with their old enemies, Johnny Reb. I first started thinking about the veterans of our nation's fratricidal war more than 15 years ago. And as a young Civil War buff, I got to know a man in my hometown of Akron, Ohio, who had spent his own childhood crisscrossing the Midwest in search of some of the last survivors of Lincoln's armies. Gary Dillon loved those old men. And the stories that he told of wrinkled old soldiers puffing on fat cigars, swapping their battle stories, made the Civil War real and immediate for me. Gary, in fact, knew the very last survivor of the Union armies, Albert Wilson, who died in August of 1956 up in Duluth, Minnesota, at the age of 109. He described Mr. Wilson and these other last surviving veterans as men who were set apart. He recalled how they would so vacantly stare into space. Even after so many decades, he said, one got the sense that they'd never really put the war behind them. When I went off to graduate school many years later, I think I was still thinking about that haunting remark. And I discovered, much to my surprise, that scholars of the Civil War scarcely knew Union veterans. Certainly not in the way that Mr. Dillon had. On that rare occasion when Civil War veterans did appear in the history books, they were rendered as flat caricatures. Billy Yank, it was supposed, beat that hasty retreat from the killing fields and slipped into a welcoming civilian society with great ease. Union victory, after all, was something that we had always described as painless and unproblematic. Union veterans, it was supposed, slumbered as the nation retreated from Reconstruction, made gluttonous demands on the federal treasury during the Gilded Age, and almost predictably embraced their former enemies in the twilight of their lives, promoting national healing at the expense of a real reckoning with the war, its cause, its charge, and its consequences. Billy Yank's old adversary, Johnny Reb, the conventional narrative went, staggered home to a ruined and war-torn landscape, emasculated by defeat and besieged by psychological, physical, and pecuniary needs that those penurious southern state governments were helpless to remedy. The South supposedly laid prostrate in defeat. In my talk this afternoon, I'm going to paint a very different picture, an almost counterintuitive picture of the road that led from Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and the road that led from the Grand Review. I will first argue that for the men of the Union Army, the war's demands persisted, mocking the peace that they had fought so hard to achieve. They tended to a staggering litany of battle injuries and emotional scars, wounds that provided ready metaphors for what they saw as the war's unfinished work. And for another, they believed, and remarkably so, I think, that their victory on the battlefield had neither settled the war's central issues nor resolved the ultimate fate of the Union. Finally, they were vexed by white Northern civilians, men and women who were eager to let bygones be bygones and were ready to move quickly beyond these painful years of the Civil War. White Northern civilians deemed returning veterans the most unsettling and unwelcome reminders of a past that they wanted only to forget. This would decidedly not be the case in the post-Civil War South. Well, Johnny Reb no doubt nursed frayed nerves and blasted hopes. He returned to a civilian society that, of course, had shared in the experience of defeat and shared in the experience of war. The scars of his conflict could neither be denied nor easily erased. John Townsend Trowbridge, a New York-born journalist, made this perfectly apparent with his now famous tour of the defeated South in the summer of 1865. He surveyed the monotonous gloom, he wrote, of broken pillars, dilapidated porches, roofless homes, cracked slabs, shell-pocked walls, pointedly observing that those haughty secessionist multitudes of 1861 had been replaced by knots of half-asleep civilians in 1865. The only sign of life ahead seemed to be those turkey buzzards that circled mournfully overhead. None of this, of course, came as any immediate relief to Confederate veterans. And there were other reminders of Confederate defeat stalking the streets, too, most dramatically in the form of African-American soldiers who largely shouldered the muskets of the federal military occupation that would tighten its tenuous hold over the South in the summer of 1865, exacerbating racial tensions. But pause a second, one Confederate veteran protested, and you can hear our master's shout of triumph ringing through the streets. And yet these things did ensure that Johnny Reb returned to a community that understood his need to make sense of the past. A community that shared, tragically, his longing for those ostensibly halcyon days of cotton as king, that would forge with him and around him a lost cause mythology, a knot of ideas positing that the war had not been waged on behalf of slavery, but rather against an overweening federal government whose superior armies and resources had made the fight unfair. So again, what I want to do this afternoon is to suggest the limits of those traditional categories that we've used to describe Civil War veterans. Neither victors nor victims, they were survivors who lived on, never really comfortable with putting away the past on either side, and never really certain, too, of the war's verdict. Ironically enough, Billy Yank won the war but couldn't bear the peace that followed, while Johnny Reb eked out a sort of victory in defeat. Ultimately, then, the experiences of Civil War veterans remind us that the stories we tell ourselves as a nation about war matter, and that public memory, far from being some academic abstraction, has profound social consequences. The Civil War, of course, raged on for 4 bloody years. It was a conflict of unimaginable scope and scale. No one on either side could have predicted the carnage of Antietam, the war's bloodiest day. The stench of Gettysburg, the war's bloodiest battle. The obscenity of Andersonville Prison, where 13,000 Union prisoners were quite literally starved to death in an open-air Georgia stockade. To speak only of the human cost, some 750,000 would be killed. That's in excess of 2% of the federal population listed in the 1860 federal census. It's to say nothing about the 1.5 million more that were wounded, the countless others who were psychologically scarred, the 25,000 at least who returned north missing an arm or a leg. Never before in all of American history was there to be so much suffering. Never before in all of American history would so many men be called veterans. For these mangled and maimed survivors, pain proved the first obstacle to forgetfulness, the first challenge to this notion that victory parades could settle all the scores. Each throb, each twinge, each sting prolonged and magnified reminiscences of the war. Our feelings will last a lifetime, one veteran acknowledged. This was to borrow from historian Drew Gilpin Faust's formulation, a living republic of suffering. 24-year-old Daniel Eldridge was a New Hampshire veteran who returned home with several fragments of rebel lead painfully wedged between the tendons of his left arm, a souvenir of the Battle of Deep Bottom in Virginia in 1864. But Dan Eldridge was activated, not silenced by his injury. Each day he toiled on a memoir of his service, every new word sending currents of pain traveling up his fractured limb. He set out to write a short narrative, but by 1867, daily work on that memoir brought him to more than 600 pages of reminiscences, illustrated with dozens of hand-inked campaign and battle maps. His injury demanded context and meaning, and the young soldier literally wrote through his pain as he searched for both. This was a process that would be replicated, of course, in the hearts and minds of veterans everywhere. Even those who returned without physical injuries found the war something difficult to escape. The momentous events of less than 10 years ago are too fresh in our memories to be forgotten at the command of any party that might be benefited by ignoring them, one veteran snarled. Conceding that the Civil War was the most intense experience of their lives, and indeed think of all of the conflicting emotions that were packed into that surreal space of 3 or 4 years, these men now, who had spent years yearning for home, felt oddly apprehensive about the prospect of peace. They longed for the oddly comforting sounds of battle, placing surplus friction primers and spare percussion caps on active railroad tracks. They would wait for the explosion. They even staged sham battles on town greens in efforts to relive the drama. In 1871, a Wisconsin man, known to mutter incomprehensibly about his military service, and a certain Captain Chase pounded a line of sticks into the ground behind his barn. And by moonlight, every night, in perfect military parlance, he would command his white bulldog to charge at the imaginary rebel picket line until he was packed off to the Wisconsin Hospital for the Insane. Others had little need for these reenactments. The war still rang in their ears and flashed before their eyes. Henry Hartwell, an artillerist from Michigan, claimed in June of 1865 that he'd never really left Chickamauga, where the rebels had seized one of his guns in a fierce Georgia battle. Even yet, the veteran claimed, he could see the rebel hosts as they wrested the rammers from the gunners' hands. He could distinctly hear the volcanic discharges as they dealt death upon the advancing foe. These men quickly apprehended that their broken bodies and haunted minds were apt metaphors for the war's uncertain verdict. One-armed and one-legged men were hardly emasculated by their injuries. They instead became some of the most vocal among Union veterans. A stunning number of amputees, appreciating the testimonial power of their hacked and hewed frames, refused to wear government-issued prosthetic appliances. They instead sat for photographs that prominently displayed their exposed stumps. Newspapers, north and south, began carping about the one-legged soldiers, waving their crutches all across the north with the news that the war is not yet over. The maimed and the crippled ones, a one-armed Iowa infantryman explained, speak with living tongues of the crimes of the Copperheads and the open rebels. And so while Union veterans never failed to declare their pride in having fought for what they believed to be a just and righteous cause, they nonetheless insisted, self-effacingly, that their victory was incomplete. We might well have hoped that when the last rebel surrendered, when our arms were victorious everywhere, one veteran grieved in October of 1866, that peace and concord and unity should prevail. But of course it did not. The South offered little reassurance that it would acquiesce to any brokered peace. The unprecedented assassination of a president, cruel race riots in Memphis and New Orleans, the rebels who exchanged gray uniforms for white hoods, the return of the antebellum white political leadership to social and cultural power all across the South, these things combined to leave Billy Yank wondering if indeed he'd won this war after all. Billy Yank's keen sense of what he fought for might have steeled him for the storm of battle, but now, ironically enough, it rattled him in the throes of the peace. He looked on as his former enemies, reassured by their escape from reprisal, defiantly belted the South with repressive black codes. We see every day the old hostility cropping out in continued acts of antagonism to the Reconstruction laws of Congress, one veteran insisted. The animus of treason and rebellion is as vindictive and deadly now as it was in 1861 and it was during the late war. Minnesotan Miles Hollister was likewise unsatisfied with the war's results. Let me see the country placed in the hands of her defenders, he said. Let me see peace and quiet and harmony and brotherly love and friendship and law and order prevail all throughout the land in all sections, he declared. And then when these results shall have been fully accomplished and the nation is in full enjoyment of the fruits thereof, only then will the great reveille be sounded for me. In short, Union veterans refused to go quietly in the face of the pardons and the lynchings and the rumors of another rebellion, one that promised to be even bloodier than the first, one that promised to make a bloodless skirmish of the first. It becomes our duty now, one Pennsylvania veteran declared, to set ourselves at work and to reap the fruits of our victory. For many ex-soldiers, reaping the fruits of that victory meant meting out punishment for treason, even if that meant compromising the classical Republican citizen soldier's obligation to return home and quickly perfume the whiff of anything martial. What will all the blood and treasure expended by the loyal people of this republic amount to, if men and measures of the late rebellion shall be again permitted to rule? One ex-soldier asked. I am not in good humor with the rebels yet, a second lieutenant from Ohio candidly confessed. Wishing only for one more opportunity, he said, to finish them off. They've caused too much loss of life and too much suffering, he explained, to be easily forgotten. One survivor of Andersonville, the Confederacy's most notorious prison hell, volunteered to assist with the construction of a wooden scaffold for ex-rebel President Jefferson Davis. I'd like to be the one to lend a helping hand, he said, that first summer after the war. Through the divine providence of God, I am spared to witness the close of this wicked and unjust rebellion. This particular individual was a carpenter before the war and even included with his petition to President Andrew Johnson blueprints for the gibbet that he proposed to construct on the east front of the Capitol. Around the country, veterans organizations passed resolutions demanding the execution of Jeff Davis, of Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, of Robert E. Lee, of other high-ranking rebel authorities. Other veterans resolved that their work would not be complete until African Americans had secured civil and political rights. Dozens of ex-soldiers volunteered not to return home, but rather to garrison the South in armies of occupation, which, much to the chagrin of white Southerners, defended former slaves and, in some cases, encouraged them to resist iniquitous labor contracts. Other former Union soldiers assumed leadership roles in the Freedmen's Bureau and took charge of some of the South's first free public schools. The claim should be made with extraordinary caution, but Billy Yank assumed a position far in advance of his pre-war self in post-war civilian society when it came to the thorny question of race. There were many great questions which we had not thought much upon before the war, one veteran candidly explained on Memorial Day 1868, reproaching Andrew Johnson for his vile brand of Reconstruction. My comrades, we today at the graves of our fallen brethren hurl our rebuke to narrow-mindedness and unfairness, and insist that we believe in the largest liberty for all men, irrespective of nation or color. No reconciliation, two comrades added, can endure which is not founded in justice. And especially is no reconciliation sure to abide that is not devoted to the highest and best interests of the whole country as a country of freedom. Union veterans were not unilaterally opposed to sectional reunion then, but they did demand a measured reconciliation, one that was mindful of the war's personal costs and its political results. Now, this was anathema to most white Northerners, which leads me to another point, that Union veterans returned home only to fight another war, a war with white Northern civilians. While Union victory was no doubt loudly cheered in the spring and summer of 1865, the hymns of that ovation hardly drowned out the bitter social and political dramas that had rent the wartime Northern home front. Union veterans, after all, were returning to a civilian population that had rioted, that had resisted, that had reached no agreement either about the meaning of this war or the participation of soldiers in it. By exalting the end of hostilities then, by declaring the Union saved and the slaves freed, Northerners quickly dismissed the extent to which the war had left behind unfinished business. With the rhetorical alchemy that transmuted stump-sweeping pus into unambiguously honorable scars, civilians foreclosed any chance for Union veterans to share their ugly, horrific war stories. Civilians could hardly countenance their tales of the battlefield and prison pen. Even the few editors who chose in popular periodicals to publish their words would delete so-called harsh adjectives. None of this was lost, of course, on the war's blue-coated ex-soldiers. As modern war psychiatrists like Robert J. Lifton and Jonathan Shea have pointed out, sharing war stories, sharing and creating a narrative of the war experience, and finding an audience, a receptive, respectful audience for that narrative, is a crucial part of any veteran's return to normalcy. But Billy Yank would impatiently wait while white Northerners instead embraced the spirit of sectional reconciliation. wearied of war work, unable again to comprehend the tempest of battle, lacking, for the most part, any activating sympathy for the plight of the former slave. They were ready to embrace the freewheeling bounty of the Gilded Age. Already one cantankerous Michigan soldier grumbled the day before Lee's surrender. The Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, at the behest of Northern civilians, had commenced to preach forgiveness and forgetfulness of the past. Ready to let bygones be bygones, Northern civilians ignored the social problems that attended demobilization. Northerners, as Jason Sokolis pointed out in a recent book on race in the 20th century, have consistently advanced a selective interpretation of the past, one that cleverly circumvents interpretive snarls and celebrates the North as a region of unimpeachable virtue, what Robert Penn Warren called the treasury of virtue. Well, true to form, Northern wartime voluntary aid societies like the Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission, they would shutter their headquarters by October of 1865 and debate not what to do for Billy Yank now that he had returned, but rather debate how best to commemorate their own heroism. State legislatures from Ohio to New York rejected legislation that would have provided temporary homes for dislocated soldiers. And plans for a federal soldiers' home met with maddening delays. It took more than a year to seat a quorum of the Board of Managers for the National Home for the Disabled Volunteer Soldier. Moreover, in an age ruled by the law of local sympathy and laissez-faire individualism, the problems of readjustment were often attributed not to the war itself and to the scalding trauma of battle, but rather to personal character flaws. Thinking Billy Yank morally depraved by the experience of combat, employers refused to hire him. Unemployment rates among veterans soared to new heights, and veterans took to begging in the streets, going door to door, hand organ grinding, alcohol, and in some cases, the opium they had first sampled in the Civil War field hospital. Scarcely 2 months after the Welcome Home celebration that had greeted Billy Yank in Lower Manhattan, a parade of more than 300 unemployed Union veterans advanced down Broadway. The first major veterans parade, by the way, after the war. The self-styled former employees of Grant and Sheridan hoisted banners into the air demanding work and wages. But as one veteran dolefully concluded, the good people of this country are tired of giving and disgusted at the sight of the crippled relic of the war. In New London, Connecticut, Mayor Frederick Lee Allen deemed an intolerable nuisance the two veterans who made their living begging for spare change on the village green and ordered them to leave town at once. Veterans' newspapers recorded dozens of similar stories all throughout the North. This treatment prompted ex-soldiers to lapse into open contempt for those who had stayed at home, or in some cases, those who had purchased a substitute or dodged the draft. Betrayal could ooze from these veterans' pens. A nation, a state, a county, a town, a city, a people that will allow their maimed and crippled soldiers to be sent to the poorhouse, or that will compel them to beg from house to house about the streets for the necessaries of life, one Illinois regimental surgeon concluded, is not fit to enjoy the blessings of a free and enlightened government. What do they know of the sufferings of our poor comrades who were starved to death in Andersonville, Belle Isle, Danville, and other rebel dens, one distraught comrade asked. What do they know of the horrors of the battlefields of Antietam, of Gettysburg, the Wilderness, Cedar Creek, Winchester, hundreds of others? Ironically enough, it was the civilians' insistent plea to put away the scenes of the war that only lent additional weight to Billy Yank's intuition that he could not. People are too ready to forget the cause of the boys in blue, one veteran bewailed, predicting accurately that unwise deference to the feelings of the pardoned rebels would prompt future generations to reflect upon the war merely as a duel where the opposing parties met to fight and then shake hands. Union veterans demanded solemn remembrance of the past. So deep a wound as this country has just received, one veteran explained, cannot be healed in but a day. In the face of civilians' willed forgetfulness, then, some veterans took desperate action. Northern newspapers reported almost daily the details of successful and unsuccessful suicide attempts among Union veterans. One Massachusetts soldier consumed a lethal dose of rat poison, while another donned his blue uniform one last time before splaying himself across the tracks of the Hudson River Railroad to await for the Poughkeepsie Express locomotive that would crush his body. A slender, tobacco-spitting misanthrope, known only to history as Charlie the Boatman, slit his throat one evening in the Milwaukee soldiers' home. Surrounded by the wads of silvery tinfoil that he'd passed countless hours shaping into cannonballs. Cannonballs, he said, like the one that hurtled toward me at Shiloh. Other veterans necessarily turned inward to one another. They organized for their own relief, made routine calls on the sick, and appealed to one another for financial aid. Indeed, the Grand Army of the Republic, the largest of the Northern veterans' orders, ought to rank in our narratives not as some political adjunct to the Republican Party, but rather as one of the most engaged and successful social welfare organizations of the late 19th century. They would do amongst themselves the work that the civilians and the government would refuse to. They stridently lobbied state legislatures and the federal government for soldiers' homes, for government jobs, for hiring preferences, for pension benefits. And in the space of these meetings and these petitions began to articulate, I think, our modern notion of veterans' rights. Does the Republic owe the soldier nothing for daring death that it might live? The Grand Army Journal asked in 1870. If it be a weakness in us to cherish old memories, yet deal tenderly with us, one old soldier implored, suffer us while we do live. Still, civilians continued to deride veterans as nuisances with an unhealthy addiction to the past. The Grand Army of the Republic in particular was singled out as an organization with sinister and decidedly un-Republican motives. They proposed to keep alive the wrath and bitterness of that dreadful time, one Northern editor insisted. We say, let all the fearful memories of the past sink into the hell to which they belong. Let us think only of wounds healed, of harvests to grow again, of seas once more covered in the ships of our commerce, of education for the ignorant, protection for the oppressed, justice for all. Confederate veterans, on the other hand, would encounter few of these difficulties. For as victory invited men and women to look forward, defeat of its own bleak necessity obliged all to look back. The men and women of the Confederacy, like their historians after them, would debate endlessly who was responsible for rebel defeat and how best to assuage its many traumas. Dear Charlotte, one Savannah woman sighed in a characteristic utterance, how can we ever give up the Confederacy? With few exceptions, Southerners venerated the dead and the living as monuments to a lost cause that they remained absolutely certain would one day be vindicated. Ladies' memorial associations got to work almost immediately after the war, decorating graves, raising money for monuments, attending veterans' reunions as dutiful sponsors. Memorial Day rites, well into the 20th century, remained an important site of Confederate memory and a cornerstone of a Southern civil religion. Tellingly, as early as 1875, Northerners were flirting with proposals to cease such observances, suggesting that they, quote, tended to too much to keep up the bitter memories of the war. A population engaged in working out the war's great issues then made quite a difference for Confederate veterans, who no doubt tended to the same ghastly wounds, haunted minds, and hemorrhaging bowels as Billy Yank. And yet, tellingly, despite all of this suffering, one will comb in vain the nearly 2,000 questionnaires distributed in the early 20th century to rebel veterans by the archivist of the state of Tennessee for a single suggestion of civilian betrayal. Ex-rebels carped not about their reception at home, but rather about the fatiguing on-foot journey that led them there. Now, Johnny Reb did, of course, lack any access to the federal pension bureaucracy, which by the final decade of the 19th century was supplying honorably discharged Union veterans with monthly checks. Still, this proved in the long run to be perhaps less of a setback than most historians have imagined. In the absence of state or federal aid for Confederate veterans, a moral economy of civilian gratitude necessarily flourished, one that was often religious in nature. By the spring of 1866, for example, the ladies in Charleston, South Carolina, had opened a subscription-funded soldiers' home that was caring for more than 70 needy ex-Confederates. That same year, 2 private citizens appealed on behalf of one-armed and one-legged soldiers in the South to the South Carolina General Assembly, which quickly approved legislation appropriating $20,000 worth of state funds to underwrite the cost of wooden arms, legs, and feet. And within a month, those Confederate amputees were arriving in Charleston to be fitted for prosthetic appliances. Equally important here is the fact that Johnny Reb could accept this assistance without imperiling his own triumphal narrative of character, masculinity, and independence. He would be sure to remind that Billy Yank and even the doughboys of the First World War had, in their notorious demand for federal benefits, surrendered all 3. We went to work in a ruined country and build up our own fortunes and character, one ex-rebel observed in the pages of Confederate Veteran magazine. We depended upon our own efforts to overcome adverse conditions. Like their counterparts in blue, then, Confederate veterans are a telling reminder that the Civil War only fitfully faded into the peace. The events of the late war between the Confederate and United States, one South Carolina veteran agitatedly confessed, are fresh in memory. Lest we forget is our refrain. Historians, then, have not done enough to consider how the Civil War continued to exact its punishing demands after Appomattox and beyond. The seeming finality of surrender, together with those perfectly dressed ranks of the Grand Review, has concealed the gnawing uncertainty that animated the immediate post-war years. Because Union victory was hardly a transparent statement of fact. It demanded much, but it settled less. Nor was Confederate defeat any meaningful augur of the path that would lead to the new century, of course, through the years of Jim Crow and across lynched African-American bodies. The Civil War was, as Walt Whitman put it, a many-threaded drama, with riddles that long after the stacking of the muskets continued to taunt and vex. Veterans on both sides who spent those post-war years leaning into crutches, begging for spare change, and guzzling bottles of rum make that painfully evident to us. Appomattox was hardly an end. It was in many ways only the beginning. Because if old soldiers never die, the wars they fight linger. As a nation once again occupying that strange and liminal space we call the post-war, we would do well to ponder that lesson. Thank you so very much. I believe we have some time for questions.
How much of an MIA problem was there in the 2 armies?
The question is about how much of an MIA problem was there in the 2 armies. And this is a significant problem, and really it's the one that historians have spent the least amount of time exploring. We're starting to get some good work because of the heroic efforts that have salvaged Clara Barton's Missing Soldiers Office, and Clara Barton took the leading role in attempting to document and find many of these missing soldiers. But it's a significant issue, and of course we forget that our casualty figures for battles include killed, wounded, captured, and missing. We've now have a rich scholarship on the dead and on the prisoners and on the wounded. But now the new frontier, I think, is the missing. It's a significant problem, the sizes of which we're only beginning to appreciate. You see in veterans' newspapers, and veterans often become kind of repositories for this sort of information. You'll see those who were left back home, the families of the missing, writing into veterans' papers, placing advertisements for 25 or 50 cents, stating the last time they'd received a letter, or the last, the regimental designation for the particular veteran in question that was missing. And you'll see those tragically continue into veterans' papers into the early 1870s. So that's another major, major long shadow of this war that we have yet to explore, but one that I hope that we will. It's an important part of the story. Yeah.
We'll have a series of questions, so pick and choose what you want. April the 6th next year will be the sesquicentennial of the founding of the GAR.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any sesquicentennial activities? Second, how did the GAR happen to become the paramount veterans organization for Union vets? Third, in terms of commitment to the 3 Civil War amendments, especially after the Grant administration, did the GAR play any role towards promotion of civil rights for African Americans? And I grew up in Batavia, Illinois, that had a integrated GAR chapter, an African American member. Was that very, very unique? And finally, in the 1950s, for Memorial Day programs, it was really a big deal, and it always included a full reading of GAR, General Order 11. How unique was that?
All very good questions. Very, very good questions. First, on the sesquicentennial of the founding of the GAR, I am not yet aware of anything that will be done, although I suspect that there will be something, and likely in Decatur, Illinois, which is the birthplace of the GAR. It was an Illinois regimental surgeon, Benjamin Stevenson, that founded the GAR there in April of 1866. But I imagine that there will be something, probably likely through the Sons of Union Veterans. As to the questions about the GAR and their relationship with civil rights, I always like to point out, and there's wonderful new scholarship on this by my friend Barbara Gannon. Her book called The One Cause should be required reading if you're interested in this kind of thing. But the GAR is the only non-segregated fraternal order in late 19th century America, which I think tells us most of what we need to know about the GAR. There are certainly in racially sensitive areas in the Deep South, because of course there are Union veterans that live in the Deep South, there are segregated posts, but the organization as a whole is an organization that is, in its constitution, colorblind. And this is a recognition of that bond of comradeship that united white and black soldiers in battle. 10% of the Union Army will be African American soldiers. 188,000 plus men shouldered muskets in blue uniforms. 10% of the Union Army, despite being only 2% of the federal population. And they never forgot that sacrifice, and they were committed to never forgetting that sacrifice. And one of the telling anecdotes about the GAR and civil rights, beyond those Civil War amendments, right, comes in the early 20th century. D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation debuts across the country, in theaters across the country. And the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, of course, stages protests and boycotts in theaters all across the country. Who's there linking hands with the NAACP at a number of these protests across the country? It's the men of the GAR in their GAR uniforms. They'll go out and link hands with that organization. They never forget. Now, certainly, I don't want to make the claim here that all Union veterans emerge and they come out of the post-war years and they're now civil rights warriors, right? They're not that, but they understand the relationship between union and emancipation in a way that they didn't at the war's outset, and they are committed to recognizing the sacrifice and the personal cost of this war for African American soldiers. I think you had a few other questions in there, but did I?
You've covered those.
I hit the bases, all right.
Hi.
Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for this because you brought out the idea that now, as our veterans are having trouble having help, that it goes all the way back.
Yeah.
And that it's hard to get help, amazingly, for people that want to defend the country.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've had enough of it.
It is, and I make the point that in the book that post-Civil War America is really a difficult place for veterans to be coming back. I mean, this is an unprecedented problem, right? I mean, the antebellum American Army is 16,000 men, mostly billeted in far-flung frontier garrisons that no one's ever heard of. There will be 1.8 million Union veterans that return. It's a problem of unimaginable scope and scale. And the federal government, immediately after the war, is infrastructurally ill-equipped to deal with it and also ideologically ill-equipped to deal with it. This is still a society that's ruled by the small r Republican ideology, right, which claims that our army should be comprised of citizen soldiers who go off to fight heroically and then return home to pick up the plow and demand no reward, right, to draw no attention. They're to slip back into civilian life with great ease. It's a laissez-faire, individualist society, and it's a society that's deeply skeptical about the stories that these men are telling when they come back from the war. I think over time, with the help of Union veterans and with the help of subsequent cohorts of veterans, we've begun to tackle the infrastructural problem, although recent reports about the VA and the just atrocious delays at those hospitals and the scandals that have riddled the VA remind us that process is not yet done. But I would suggest that before we spend a lot of time beating up on white northern civilians, we would ask what we share with them, right? Because I think ideologically while we've made corrections, that we still very much share that skepticism. And we still lack, as a nation, a national ritual of reintegration. We lack a way as a nation to have a conversation that will acknowledge the truth of their stories and the depth of their sacrifices. We still haven't figured out a way to do that. It's a difficult thing to figure out, but we have not had that national conversation. I think the other important point to acknowledge here is that the more controversial the war is, the more difficult the reintegration will be. World War II veterans are kind of the anomaly because it's arguably the most unambiguous of our wars, right? And we see that World War II, the greatest generation, come back in a way very different from what I've just described with Civil War veterans or from Vietnam veterans or even from veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But when there is ambiguity, and when there is, bitter social and political dramas about the war, that has and when the war's verdict is not yet settled, there's a tangible correlation to that process of reintegration. We like to think about the Civil War as something that was, unambiguous. We have Appomattox syndrome. We say, oh, the North must have been completely united behind all of their soldiers, right? We forget about that 45% of the North that went and voted against Abraham Lincoln in the 1864 presidential election, the deep swaths of copperheads everywhere. We think, yes, the Civil War settles the relationship between the states and the federal government, and it no doubt kills slavery with the 13th Amendment. But then it places on the table a host of other questions, right? What's the relationship between race and democracy? What's the obligation of the federal government to the former slave, to the veteran, to his widow, to the orphan? What do we do now, right? How do we punish treason if we punish it at all? All of these questions are raised, and it's this murky period, right? Strikingly similar to the one I think that we're in now as we're trying to figure out and process, right, what these last 10 years have been all about. Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Jordan, thank you so much for the excellent and spirited presentation here. Really appreciated it. And as the previous comment over here, really do. Regarding Soldiers Home here in D.C., 3 miles from here, 3 miles from the White House, Lincoln's Cottage, where Lincoln spent about a quarter of his time, evidently, with his family and him in riding back and forth, of course. Do you know, are there published, are the records pretty good on how many Rebs and how many Feds were in residence, and if that led to any personal strife?
Well, Confederates were not permitted to live in any of the Federal soldiers' homes. And it was difficult enough to be a Union soldier. And
were there any in the South?
In the South, there are individual states will sponsor homes, and there'll even be private groups like the Ladies Memorial Associations will establish that home in Charleston. And ironically enough, despite the economy and the devastation and the ruin, in some places in the South, Confederate veterans are getting into soldiers' homes more quickly than Union veterans are. But there won't be any mixing there. It'll be the same procedure as with the national cemeteries that emerged from the Civil War. There'll be no Confederate burials permitted as a recognition that this was a treasonous rebellion against the United States. And the same thing with the pensions too. No access to the pension dollars, and boy, they would complain about that and do their level best, and forget that they had opposed the federal government, and forget that they had leveled this rebellion. They had attempted to get that pension money.
Yeah, last just an hour from here from Royal Virginia, they still refer to it, the older families and so on, as the war between the states.
Yes. Yep. All right, we have time for one more question, I'm told.
You actually prompted it. Could you talk about how pensions were allocated and the amounts awarded a bit?
Good question. Pensions initially, and the pensions will start during the war itself. Actually, this is debated and discussed in the wake of the First Battle of Bull Run, right? Which is kind of this, the grim awakening to what we've gotten ourselves into. Initially, it's for those who have war-related, battle-related injuries and disabilities. So if you are an amputee, and they will literally, and it's terrible, and you go upstairs and there are shelves of the pension files that go through these forms. You're entitled to a certain amount of money per injury. They set a standardized schedule of what you're entitled to. During the war years itself, if you lost your arm, you're entitled to $8 per month. By way of comparison, if you are an average carpenter in 1865, you're making $30 per month. So don't spend it all in one place. So it's $8 per month, and it's initially only a disability pension. And really, when I say disability pension, it's meant that it has to be a bodily injury, an amputee, something like that. It's very, very difficult for you to get a pension, for a disease or something to prove. You have to prove the etiology of the disease, right? And that this nagging cough that I had that started, my winter on the plains outside of Fredericksburg, I didn't have that before the war, I promise, right? And they, go through this rigorous process, right, of those adjudicating and evaluating and assessing the validity of those claims. The pensions will be liberalized with the activism and the lobbying of the GAR over time. And there will be attempts to create pensions for specific cohorts of veterans, for an ex-prisoner of war pension, for instance, that will fail. And it's not until 1890, right, so 25 years after the war, that Benjamin Harrison will ink into law what's called the Dependent Pension Act, which gives a blanket kind of old age retirement pension to anyone with an honorable discharge. That doesn't happen until 1890, when tragically many of those who were most horrifically injured and disabled and disease-ridden by the war, they were already long gone by that point. But the pensions would also, you could also get a pension if you were, of course, had a child, you were a father with children. Your children were under the age of 16. The children were entitled to a pension that way. Of course, the widow's pensions, and I believe we're still, it was in the news a few weeks ago, I believe we're still paying out 2 of those. But I think, the statistics are often bandied about that, it's something like, in excess of 30% of the federal budget by 1901, which seems like a really impressive figure. I think that says less about the pensions and more about the federal budget in 1901. All right? All right. Well, thank you so much.